Some people think stealing land is the biggest mistake an HOA can make. They're wrong. The biggest mistake is building something worth millions of dollars on land they never bothered to verify belonged to them. The first thing I heard wasn't birdsong or cattle moving across the pasture. It was the steady mechanical hum of industrial generators rolling across the morning air before the sun had even cleared the eastern ridge. That sound didn't belong on my ranch. Neither did the blinking red light cutting through the pale Texas dawn like a warning beacon. My name is Ethan Walker, and my family has owned this ranch for 3 generations. My grandfather bought these rolling hills after returning from the Korean War, and every fence post, every oak tree, every watering pond carried a story he had left behind. I'd spent the previous week moving cattle to our north grazing fields after an early summer storm soaked the lower pasture. It should have been an ordinary drive home. Instead, the smell of fresh concrete, diesel exhaust, and hot electrical equipment reached me before I even crossed my front gate. I eased my pickup over the familiar gravel road, but something felt wrong. The gravel crunched beneath my tires exactly as it always had, yet the horizon looked different. Then I saw it. Rising from the highest hill on my property stood a massive steel cell tower, nearly 200 feet tall, its galvanized frame shining beneath the first rays of sunlight. Thick cables disappeared into freshly poured concrete foundations. Utility trucks lined the access road. White service vans carried logos from contractors I'd never hired. Men wearing reflective vests moved between equipment cabinets while generators vibrated with a low metallic growl that echoed across land where my cattle had grazed only days earlier. I stopped my truck so suddenly my coffee splashed across the dashboard. For several seconds, I simply stared through the windshield, convinced I had somehow driven onto someone else's property. But the weathered windmill was still there. The old red barn stood exactly where my father had painted it 20 years ago. The creek shimmered beyond the cottonwoods. This was my ranch, every acre of it. One contractor noticed me watching and walked over carrying a clipboard. His expression stayed polite, almost rehearsed. "Morning, sir. You'll need to park farther back. We're wrapping up final inspections today." I looked from his clipboard to the tower towering over my pasture. "Who approved this?" I asked. He barely hesitated. "The HOA handled everything. Community infrastructure project." I actually laughed because I thought he was joking. The nearest subdivision sat beyond my southern fence line. Their manicured lawns had never crossed onto my property. "You might want to check your paperwork again," I told him quietly. "This hill doesn't belong to the HOA. His smile faded just enough to reveal uncertainty before he answered. "That's not what we were told." I turned back toward the tower. Red aviation lights blinked against the brightening sky while antennas silently reached in every direction, already carrying signals through the air above land my family had protected for over 60 years. They thought they had built a communications empire. They had no idea they had just built the most expensive tenant Texas had ever seen. I climbed out of my truck and let the silence between the generator pulses settle into my thoughts. The strange thing about land is that it remembers every footprint, every fence line, and every promise made across generations. My grandfather, Walter Walker, bought this ranch in 1958 with money he saved after years of working construction across West Texas. Back then, this place was nothing more than scrub brush, limestone, and stubborn mesquite trees. Most people looked at these hills and saw empty ground. My grandfather saw a future. My father expanded the cattle operation one pasture at a time, repaired every weathered fence with his own hands, and taught me that ownership was not measured by paperwork alone. Ownership was measured by responsibility. Every spring we repaired washouts after heavy rain. Every summer we checked water tanks before sunrise because cattle could not wait for cooler weather. Every fall we rotated grazing sections so the land could recover naturally. Nothing on this ranch happened by accident. Even the hill where that tower now stood had its own purpose. It was the highest point on nearly 400 acres, catching every breeze that rolled across central Texas. As a kid, I used to climb that hill with my father before sunrise. We would drink coffee from old metal thermoses while watching deer move through the morning fog below us. He always joked that if anyone ever wanted the perfect view of the county, they would have to ask the Walker family first. Standing there now, breathing in the sharp scent of fresh concrete mixed with cedar and dry grass, I realized someone had skipped that conversation entirely. My ranch sat just outside a fast-growing subdivision called Cedar Ridge Estates. 10 years earlier, it had been nothing but open pasture bordering my southern fence. Then developers arrived. Streets appeared almost overnight. Identical houses spread across former farmland like rows of perfectly aligned dominoes. Neatly trimmed lawns replaced grazing fields. Decorative stone entrances replaced cattle guards. I never objected to any of it because people had every right to build on land they legally owned. We simply stayed good neighbors. I maintained my fences. They maintained theirs. The property line had always been respected. At least I believed it had been. I reached down and picked up a handful of dry Texas soil, letting it slip through my fingers exactly the way my grandfather used to. The ground felt familiar. Solid. Permanent. My phone buzzed with a message from my ranch foreman asking whether I had made it home safely. I looked back toward the blinking red lights towering above me and answered with only 3 words. "We have company." Before he could reply, another convoy of contractor trucks rolled through my entrance gate without slowing down. Their tires scattered gravel across the same road my father had graded every spring for nearly 30 years. None of the drivers even glanced toward the ranch house. They acted like they belonged there. That was the moment I stopped feeling surprised. Surprise fades quickly. Curiosity lasts longer. And quiet determination lasts longer still. Someone had invested a fortune building on my land. I intended to find out exactly who believed they had permission, and more importantly, who had convinced them they did. By noon I had one name, and it kept appearing everywhere I looked. Victoria Hayes, president of Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association, former real estate broker, self-appointed guardian of neighborhood standards. Around the subdivision, people spoke about her with polite smiles, but those smiles always faded the moment she walked away. She drove a white luxury sport utility vehicle that always looked freshly polished, even after a dust storm. And she carried herself like every sidewalk, mailbox, and front lawn existed because she had personally approved it. I had crossed paths with her only twice before. The first time was during a county zoning meeting when she introduced herself as someone who believed responsible development benefited everyone. The second time she stopped by my fence line and casually suggested that my cattle occasionally made the subdivision feel less upscale. I simply smiled and reminded her that the cattle had been there decades before the subdivision. She did not appreciate the answer. Standing beside the newly built tower, I watched another pickup carrying construction materials disappear toward the hill while dust drifted through the warm afternoon air. The smell of diesel mixed with freshly cut cedar, creating an odor that did not belong anywhere near my pastures. Every few minutes, another technician climbed the steel structure with practiced confidence, tightening equipment that clearly represented millions of dollars in investment. Nobody builds something this expensive without months of planning. That thought refused to leave my mind. I drove into town and stopped at the small diner near the county courthouse where ranchers, deputies, surveyors, and utility workers usually gathered for lunch. Places like that have a way of collecting information long before official reports ever appear. I ordered black coffee and listened. It did not take long before someone at the next table mentioned Cedar Ridge's new communications project. According to the conversation, Victoria had been celebrating the tower for weeks, calling it a victory that would improve service, increase property values, and bring modern infrastructure to the community. She apparently told residents that every legal detail had already been handled. One retired surveyor looked over at me after recognizing my last name. His expression shifted the moment he realized where I lived. "I thought they had worked something out with your family," he said quietly. I shook my head. Nobody has spoken to me. The coffee suddenly tasted more bitter than usual. If people around town believed an agreement existed, then someone had worked very hard to create that impression. On my drive back to the ranch, I noticed freshly installed signs directing contractor traffic toward the subdivision entrance, each one displaying the project name with confident professionalism. Everything looked organized. Everything looked official. That was exactly what bothered me. Real property disputes rarely begin with loud arguments. They begin with quiet assumptions that nobody bothers to verify. As the afternoon sun reflected off the steel tower, I realized Victoria Hayes was counting on one assumption above all others. She believed I would react emotionally before I reacted intelligently. She did not know my grandfather had taught me that the strongest move is usually the quietest one, especially when the other side is still convinced they have already won. The next morning, I drove straight to the county records office instead of the tower. Anger has a way of making people careless, and I had no intention of giving anyone the satisfaction of watching me lose my temper. The courthouse smelled exactly the way it always had, like old paper, floor polish, and decades of history preserved inside steel filing cabinets. Mrs. Dawson, the clerk who had worked there longer than I had been alive, greeted me with the same warm smile she always did until she noticed the survey map folded beneath my arm. "Something wrong out at the ranch?" she asked. I simply nodded and requested every document filed over the past 2 years involving Cedar Ridge Estates, utility easements, telecommunications permits, and adjacent property surveys. While she disappeared into the archive room, I walked over to the large county map mounted on the wall. The black property lines looked as familiar as my own handwriting. The tower sat exactly where I already knew it did, well inside my recorded boundary. There was no question about that. What I needed to understand was how so many people had convinced themselves otherwise. Nearly an hour later, Mrs. Dawson returned pushing a cart stacked with folders. I spent the rest of the afternoon turning page after page while sunlight slowly shifted across the wooden table beside me. Building permits, environmental reviews, utility inspections, road access requests. Everything appeared professionally prepared. The engineering work was impressive. The contractors had followed safety standards. County inspectors had signed off on structural requirements. Every document looked legitimate until I reached the property authorization section. That page stopped me cold. Instead of a recorded lease from the landowner, the application referenced a community access agreement submitted by Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. It described the construction site as an area under neighborhood management, but nowhere did it include my signature, my family's trust, or any recorded authorization from the actual owner. Someone had built an entire approval process around an assumption instead of ownership. Late that afternoon, I finally drove into Cedar Ridge itself. Fresh landscaping framed the entrance with colorful flowers and decorative stone walls. Families rode bicycles along quiet streets while sprinklers clicked rhythmically across perfectly trimmed lawns. Near the clubhouse stood a large banner celebrating improved wireless coverage for the community. Residents walked past it smiling, completely unaware that the project they were proudly celebrating rested on land their association did not own. As I stepped inside the clubhouse, cool conditioned air replaced the dry Texas heat. Victoria Hayes stood near a display board covered with architectural renderings, laughing with several board members. The moment she noticed me, her smile changed just enough to become something more practiced than genuine. "Mr. Walker," she said smoothly, "I was wondering when you would stop by." I looked directly at her without raising my voice. "I have a simple question. Who gave permission to build on my ranch?" She folded her hands together with remarkable confidence. "Our attorneys reviewed everything. The project is already complete, the contractors have been paid, and the community is benefiting. Sometimes progress requires flexibility." Her words floated through the room with complete certainty, but I noticed something else. She never answered my question. Not once did she say she had my permission. She simply spoke as though completion itself had erased the need for it. Walking back to my truck, I could still hear the distant hum of equipment drifting across the evening breeze. The tower was finished. The money had already been spent. And for the first time, I realized that was exactly what would make the truth impossible for them to ignore. Most people assume the law moves the moment you discover something is wrong. It does not. It moves when you bring it facts, and facts take time. For the next several days, I stayed away from the tower except to check on my cattle. Every morning, the steady electrical hum rolled across the pasture, while white contractor trucks came and went as if they had been using my ranch their entire lives. Fresh tire tracks carved deeper into the gravel road my father had built with an old road grader more than 25 years earlier. The smell of diesel lingered over the hillside long after sunset, mixing with cedar and dry grass until even the evening breeze felt unfamiliar. Friends kept asking why I was not blocking the entrance or demanding the workers leave. My answer never changed. Not yet. Instead, I hired an independent surveyor named Daniel Brooks, a man whose reputation rested on precision rather than opinions. We walked every corner marker together beneath the afternoon heat, measuring distances with modern equipment while comparing them against original county plats recorded decades before. Every reading confirmed exactly what I already knew. The tower stood well inside my property. Daniel handed me a signed survey packet and quietly said, "There is no overlap. There is no boundary confusion. This is your land." I thanked him, placed the documents inside a waterproof folder, and drove home without making a single phone call. The following morning, I met with an attorney in the county seat. He studied the survey, reviewed the permit documents, and leaned back with a thoughtful expression. "You have a strong ownership claim," he admitted, "but litigation could take years. They will argue good faith, administrative error, public benefit, and substantial investment. Nobody likes shutting down infrastructure after millions of dollars have already been spent." I left his office with more questions than answers. By the end of that week, local gossip had already turned against me. According to conversations at the feed store and the diner, I was supposedly trying to stop better cellular service for the entire community. Some people even believed I wanted the tower removed simply because I disliked the subdivision. None of that was true, but rumors travel much faster than property records. Meanwhile, Victoria Hayes appeared in the local newspaper smiling beside a photograph of the completed project. The article praised community leadership and modern connectivity while never mentioning the landowner beneath the structure. I folded the newspaper carefully and placed it beside the survey packet instead of throwing it away. Every statement mattered. Every public claim became another piece of the timeline. Late one evening, I parked my truck on the ridge overlooking the pasture. The red aviation lights blinked against a sky full of stars while my cattle grazed peacefully below, completely indifferent to legal disputes and public opinion. I realized something important as I listened to the rhythmic hum echo across the ranch. Everyone around me was focused on the tower itself. They were arguing about whether it should stay or go. I was asking a different question entirely. If someone builds a multi-million-dollar business on private land without permission, what exactly is that business worth to the person who actually owns the ground beneath it? The answer was beginning to take shape, and it was far more valuable than tearing anything down. The breakthrough did not come from an expensive attorney or a dramatic courtroom revelation. It came from a dusty storage cabinet inside the old ranch office that had not been opened since my father passed away. I was looking for livestock vaccination records when I noticed a weathered metal box tucked beneath a stack of faded topographical maps. The hinges squeaked as I opened it, releasing the familiar smell of aged paper, leather, and cedar that instantly reminded me of my grandfather's study. Inside were decades of carefully organized folders labeled in his unmistakable handwriting. Grazing leases, water rights, mineral surveys, utility correspondence. My grandfather believed every document deserved a proper place because, as he often said, memories fade, but paperwork remembers everything. I spent the afternoon sorting through yellowed pages while sunlight drifted across the wooden floorboards. Then I found a folder marked Hilltop Access. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing because experience had taught me that the most important discoveries usually look ordinary at first glance. Inside was a correspondence file from the late 1980s between my grandfather and a regional utility company. They had approached him about placing temporary communications equipment on the highest ridge during an emergency weather monitoring project. My grandfather declined the permanent installation but agreed to allow survey crews onto the property for a limited evaluation period. Attached to the letter was a drafted lease agreement that had never been signed. Across the bottom, my grandfather had written a single sentence in blue ink. No commercial use without a recorded land lease approved by the owner. I read that sentence 3 more times before carefully placing the paper back into its sleeve. It explained everything. My grandfather had anticipated exactly this kind of situation decades earlier. Any company wanting to operate revenue-generating equipment on that hill needed a formal lease with the landowner. Permission could not be assumed. It could not be transferred through neighboring property. It certainly could not be granted by an organization that never owned the hill in the first place. The tower itself suddenly looked very different in my mind. It was no longer simply a steel structure standing on my pasture. It was a commercial business operating from private land without the one agreement that actually mattered. I drove back to the county records office the next morning carrying copies of every document. Mrs. Dawson helped me verify that no recorded lease had ever been filed against my property. Nothing. Not under my name. Not under my father's. Not under my grandfather's estate. The public record was completely silent where a multi-million-dollar commercial lease should have existed. Walking back outside, I could hear my boots echo against the courthouse steps while the warm Texas wind carried the distant scent of fresh-cut hay from nearby fields. For the first time since discovering the tower, I smiled. Not because I wanted anyone to lose, but because I finally understood where the real leverage had been hiding all along. Everyone had spent weeks talking about permits, construction schedules, engineering approvals, and community benefits. Almost nobody had asked the simplest question in the entire project. Who was paying the owner for using the land beneath the tower every single day? The answer was nobody. And that unanswered question was about to become the most expensive oversight Cedar Ridge Estates had ever made. Once I understood what was missing, I stopped thinking like a rancher defending property and started thinking like a landlord evaluating a commercial tenant. There is a difference. One argues over fences. The other calculates value. Early Monday morning, I met with my attorney again, this time carrying the original family documents, the certified survey, copies of the county filings, and photographs taken every day since I returned home. He spread everything across the conference table without saying a word for several minutes. The only sound came from the quiet hum of the air conditioner and the soft rustle of paper as he compared dates, signatures, and legal descriptions. Finally, he looked up and smiled. For the first time since I had hired him. "Do not ask for the tower to come down," he said. "It is worth far more standing exactly where it is." That single sentence confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. By that afternoon, we prepared a formal notice addressed not to the homeowners association, but directly to the telecommunications company operating the equipment. The letter was respectful, precise, and supported by every document we possessed. It explained that the structure occupied privately owned land without a recorded commercial ground lease and invited the company to resolve the matter professionally before unnecessary litigation affected operations. Attached to the notice was something nobody at Cedar Ridge expected to see. An invoice. Not for damages. Not for punishment. For rent. Commercial ground rent calculated at the regional market rate beginning on the day construction crews first entered my ranch, along with reasonable access fees for maintenance vehicles using my private road. Every number was supported by comparable lease agreements from similar communications sites across Texas. There was no exaggeration, only math. We sent the package by certified mail and electronic delivery before noon. Then we waited. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was repairing a water trough near the north pasture. The caller identified himself as a regional property manager for the telecommunications company. His voice remained professional, but I could hear genuine concern beneath every carefully chosen word. He asked whether I would be available for a meeting at the ranch the following morning. I agreed. Just after sunrise, 2 pickup trucks and a white sport utility vehicle pulled into my driveway. The visitors stepped out carrying clipboards instead of construction equipment. They spent nearly an hour reviewing survey markers, examining recorded plats, and comparing coordinates against their engineering maps. Nobody argued. Nobody raised a voice. One engineer quietly admitted that every location reading placed the tower squarely inside my boundary. Another employee asked a question that immediately told me where their concern truly rested. "Has anyone from the homeowners association ever provided you with a lease agreement?" I answered honestly. No one has ever asked for one. Silence settled over the hill except for the familiar hum of equipment coming from the tower behind us. The property manager removed his glasses, looked toward the blinking antennas above the pasture, and slowly shook his head. We believed the site rights had already been secured. I nodded without any satisfaction. So did I, until I checked. Before leaving, he thanked me for remaining patient and assured me their legal department would contact my attorney immediately. As their vehicles disappeared down my gravel road, I noticed something had changed. For the first time since this entire situation began, nobody was talking about what the homeowners association wanted. They were talking about the landowner they should have spoken to from the very beginning. Everything moved surprisingly fast once the telecommunications company realized the problem belonged to them as much as it belonged to me. Less than 2 weeks after our meeting, their legal team requested a formal conference at the county administration building. Representatives from the company arrived carrying thick binders filled with engineering drawings, lease templates, and compliance reports. My attorney and I brought only one organized folder because the facts had not changed. The land was mine. The survey was correct. The missing lease was real. Victoria Hayes arrived nearly 20 minutes late, with 2 board members from Cedar Ridge Estates. She walked into the conference room wearing the same confident smile I had seen at the clubhouse, but it disappeared the moment the telecommunications attorney projected the official property survey onto a large screen. Every colored boundary line pointed to the same conclusion. The tower had never been inside association property. The room became remarkably quiet. Nobody interrupted. Nobody argued over measurements. Instead, the discussion shifted toward responsibility. The company explained that they had relied on documents submitted during the development process and believed the site rights had already been secured before construction began. Their attorney apologized directly to me for the oversight and stated they wanted to resolve the matter without disrupting service to thousands of customers. I appreciated the honesty because it was the first genuine accountability I had heard since this situation began. Victoria attempted to redirect the conversation toward community benefits and public convenience, insisting everyone had acted in good faith. Then the telecommunications attorney asked a question so simple that it seemed to freeze the entire room. Can you provide the executed ground lease signed by the landowner? Victoria opened one folder after another, turning pages more quickly each time. The quiet rustling of paper echoed across the conference table while nobody spoke. Finally, she admitted there was no signed lease. My attorney slid a prepared document across the table. It contained a professionally drafted commercial ground lease reflecting current regional market rates, reasonable maintenance access terms, insurance requirements, and payment schedules. There were no surprise penalties, no unrealistic demands, and no attempt to force the tower's removal. The proposal simply recognized the legal relationship that should have existed before construction ever started. After reviewing the document, the telecommunications representatives requested a short recess. They returned less than an hour later with one revision concerning maintenance, scheduling, and accepted every other material term. The agreement also included compensation for the period beginning when construction first occupied my property, along with reimbursement for unauthorized access across my private ranch road. As everyone signed the final paperwork, I looked through the conference room window toward the distant hills where the tower stood against the bright Texas sky. It had not moved an inch, yet everything about it had changed. It was no longer an unwanted structure imposed on my ranch. It had become a lawful commercial tenant operating under an agreement with the person who actually owned the land beneath it. Walking outside afterward, I noticed the warm breeze carrying the familiar scent of cedar and dry grass instead of fresh concrete. My attorney smiled as he placed the fully executed lease into my hands. Congratulations, he said quietly. You did not just protect your property. You turned patience into an asset. At that moment, I realized the greatest victory had never been proving someone else was wrong. It was making sure the law finally recognized what my family had known for generations. 6 months later, the tower had become just another part of the landscape, almost like the old windmill my grandfather built decades earlier. The red aviation lights still blinked every evening across the Texas sky, and the low mechanical hum still drifted over the pasture whenever the wind came from the south. The difference was simple. Every signal traveling through those antennas now crossed my land with permission instead of assumption. On the first business day of every month, an electronic deposit appeared in my ranch account exactly as outlined in the lease agreement. The amount covered far more than the inconvenience of losing one hilltop. It paid for new fencing along the western pasture, upgraded water systems for the cattle, fresh roofing on the equipment barn, and scholarships that my family quietly donated to the local agricultural education program each year. My grandfather always believed land should continue providing for future generations. In an unexpected way, that hill was doing exactly that. The telecommunications company proved to be an excellent tenant once everything was handled properly. Maintenance crews called ahead before entering the property. Gates were closed behind every vehicle. Access roads were repaired whenever heavy equipment caused damage. Professional respect replaced confusion because the relationship finally rested on something stronger than assumptions. It rested on a signed agreement. Cedar Ridge Estates also changed. Residents eventually learned the full story through public county records instead of neighborhood rumors. Many were surprised to discover the dispute had never been about blocking better service or opposing progress. It had always been about respecting ownership before construction begins. Several homeowners even stopped by the ranch over the following months, apologizing for believing the early gossip. We shared coffee on the porch, talked about cattle prices, rainfall, and football, and left the past where it belonged. As for Victoria Hayes, she quietly stepped away from the Homeowners Association board before the next annual election. I never celebrated that outcome because my goal had never been to embarrass anyone. Positions come and go, but reputations are built one decision at a time. I hoped she learned the same lesson everyone else eventually did. Confidence can move projects forward, but only integrity keeps them standing. Sometimes I still drive up to that hill just before sunset. The steel tower glows gold beneath the fading light, while my cattle graze peacefully below, completely uninterested in contracts, surveys, or legal records. I sit on the tailgate of my pickup with a cup of coffee, listening to the wind move through the grass exactly the way my father and grandfather once did. The only new sound is the quiet rhythm of modern technology working above a piece of land that has always belonged to my family. Looking at that view, I often think back to the morning I first saw the tower and believed everything had been taken from me. I could not have been more wrong. They believed they had built a communications network on forgotten land. What they actually built was the most valuable lease my ranch had ever known. My grandfather used to tell me that ownership is not about raising your voice. It is about knowing exactly where you stand when everyone else has forgotten. He was right. Justice is rarely loud. It is patient, documented, and inevitable.